This is a continuation of part 1, so if you want to catch up and see what I had the least fun with this year, then that's linked. But now we're on to the more juicy middle portion, the games that I had a lot of fun with, but also had plenty of mixed opinions. So let's start from the middle bottom and get to the middle top. The start of Ghostwire Tokyo was honestly some of the most fun I've had in an open world game in recent memory, and that's with a first person game which I usually don't enjoy as much. The atmosphere was palpable, the combat was satisfying, and best of all, the way you explore and interact with the detailed environments was so much fun. The areas were all packed with little secrets and encouraged going out of your way, and since your character is perfectly balanced, you have to be a little stealthy. Not the annoying oppressive kind of stealth sections you want to be over, but the natural stealthiness that just makes you feel more aware of your environment. Some of the areas and missions I completed in these early hours were some of the best I played this year, and I still remember those sections of the map vividly. But then, after not very long, you'll start to learn more abilities, get more powerful, and be able to traverse every area with ease. Usually, this kind of growth makes open world games more satisfying, since it's nice to be able to blast through areas you'd struggled with, but in this case, it came far too soon. It felt like there was a clear point where I'd stopped engaging with the setting as much as I had to, because my abilities meant I could fly up any building, skip any street, and fast travel wherever I needed to be. It went from being one of the most engaging open world games I'd played in years, to another standard go to the marker on the map and do the task, then repeat, which is a massive downgrade. By the last third of the game, I was doing the bare minimum, just going to main story markers, skipping side content, and not interacting with the environment as much, because I just didn't need to. Not to say that the end of the game was awful, but I was way less invested and kind of just sad that a game that has started so strong was let down by poorly paced progression. I'm sure that you might be able to have some more fun if you self-impose some limitations, but if you're playing in a vacuum and you don't have any context, you wouldn't know that you should do that. I've heard rumours of a sequel, and since the game's faults would be quite easy to fix, I hope that they can nail that with a follow-up. A genre of games which I often overlook is party games, since it's easy to default to Smash or Mario Kart and call it a day. But while it flopped sales-wise, Nintendo might have unintentionally made the Wii U to be the perfect console for party games, with one of the most fun being Game & Wario. The game is unfortunately quite hard to come by since it was underprinted and the Wii U eShop is now down, but if you can find it, I would highly recommend checking it out. Like a lot of other games from early in the Wii U's life, it takes full advantage of the system's unique qualities to make each of its minigames something you wouldn't be able to find anywhere else. A clear standout is Islands, or as it's more lovingly referred to, Fronk, which requires players catapulting their Fronks from the gamepad to islands on the screen and trying to score enough points while also trying to knock off other players' Fronks. It's also got a drawing game, which is a much more efficient version of Pictionary, with the drawing sent directly from the gamepad to the screen, making guessing a lot more practical. I also appreciate that multiplayer games don't require you to own multiple Wii remotes and only use a gamepad, since that's a problem with a lot of other multiplayer Wii U titles. But the multiplayer is the main issue with the game as well. Out of the selection of minigames you can play, only 4 of them use multiplayer, with the others being solo only. So while taking turns on minigames can be fun when hanging out with certain friends, games like this tend to thrive more when the interactivity and social element is more encouraged. As well as this, some minigames are just nowhere near as fun as others, with some of them feeling very simple and not worth revisiting. But for the better games included and wacky presentation Wario games often have, and of course, Fronks, it deserves to get more appreciation. Earlier on I spoke about Saints Row 2022 actually just being average instead of awful, and a step up from that is Immortals of Avium being seen as below average when it's actually a pretty strong title which is well worth trying out. I was interested in playing it since launch, since a magic-based shooter seems interesting as well as the fantasy setting it presented, but since it was selling as a full price £70 product, I waited, and since its reviews were underwhelming, it very quickly discounted. So by late December, only 3 months after release, with a small rewards point voucher, I was able to get it down to just £5, and for that cost at least, I had plenty of fun. Of course, I would have been a lot more critical if I paid full price, but I would have happily paid more for the experience I got. The main criticism it received was for its occasionally cringeworthy writing, commonly compared to MCU level humour, and while yes, these moments are a bit hard to watch, but if you can ironically appreciate it, then that aspect is a lot more bearable. And even if the dialogue wasn't that well written, the overarching narrative was quite well told, and since it was kept simple enough as well, it was easy to follow. But aside from the minor issues with the writing, the combat and gameplay itself was a lot of fun. It only takes about 10 hours to complete, and since the progression is kept quite linear, it's paced very well too. But if you want it to last longer, there are plenty of opportunities for backtracking and spending more time exploring. The combat never gets old since you're consistently given new abilities, and the skill tree progresses quite quickly, especially if you explore and get bonus XP. It's honestly a great action game with a beautiful world, and while the characters have some cringy lines, that doesn't make the game irredeemable. I bought this game when it launched on Switch in 2018, and soon after I played a few levels on a train journey. An awful idea, since while it was fun, it also made me super nauseous, and I struggled getting to grips with the controls on some laggy detached Joy-Cons, staring at the tiny screen popped up on a wobbly train chair. All in all, it put me off for half a decade, but in 2023 I put it behind me and tried again, and shock horror, but Katamari is fun. It's just an enjoyable, satisfying idea which could be too easy, but is well balanced with time limits and certain goals which stop it from being a pushover. Part of what motivated me to revisit this title is the apparently better sequel has now been remade and ported too, so I thought I should at least complete the original first. The presentation is quirky and the game is good at letting you progress at your own pace, and once I reached credits I would have happily kept playing the side content. But since I now have the sequel, I thought I should hold off until I play that so I don't oversaturate my Katamari enjoyment. I hope the remake for the sequel will be just as fun to play in 2024, and I also hope it performs well enough that the other titles will get ported as well. At the end of my 2022 ranking, I gave a quick prediction of what I'll enjoy most the next year. One was the next part of the Final Fantasy VII remake, which ended up getting delayed, and the other was Tears of the Kingdom. And while I enjoyed parts of it, I also happened to enjoy 40 other games more than it, which as you can imagine, I didn't expect. Part of me actually wants to put it a little lower since I was so disappointed in it as such a big fan of Breath of the Wild, but I couldn't in good faith say it was actually worse than the games below it. My main issue is what was done in the 6 years between this game and Breath of the Wild. I saw some people say that it was impressive that this game managed to be made in 6 years, and while I get that the melding system and super hand would have taken a lot of effort, when it comes to actual changes made to the world, it definitely feels like not enough was done to make retreading the map worth it. Sure, there are the sky areas and then the underground areas, but after a certain amount of exploration you realise that while they are big, they have a lot of repeated or very similar puzzles or sections that make going between them pretty unrewarding. And this being made worse since the game shares one of the main problems with Breath of the Wild, with loot and treasure just not being that exciting, made a little worse this time with a lot of repeated costumes too. And in the overworld, very few areas had meaningful differences, with only a few changes made in the areas I explored, and a lot of the changes being temporary, with how after beating the dungeons, the towns will just revert to exactly how they were in Breath of the Wild. The world just felt so similar, and sure I could make a car or an aircraft to make traversing it faster, but unfortunately the gimmick of that wore a little thin quite soon as well. Of course, that depends on personal taste, but being able to make vehicles on command whenever I want isn't worth a map that's from 2017 with some glitter shaken over it. I spent 70 hours exploring about half of the map and doing a little over half of the story, but with how often I was taking breaks to go do the underworld or explore sky areas, I was progressing the map even slower than I did in Breath of the Wild, and it just made it feel so bloated. Sure, I could have rushed around to fast track the story, which also didn't remedy the storytelling issues Breath of the Wild had, but that's a whole other problem. But if I did this, then it would feel like I was missing out on the few new areas this game offered. It's not an original talking point to say that Tears of the Kingdom serves as an amazing expansion pass to Breath of the Wild, but the more I think about it, the more that rings true. I'll likely go back soon, maybe even next year to finish it, and I might even make a follow-up video articulating these modelled up thoughts better, but for now, for my own sake, I'll stop bullying Link, since there's a lot here to enjoy. But I'm hoping that whenever I play a new Zelda game, it's in a drastically different Hyrule. From the most high-profile first-party Nintendo release of the year to one of the more low-key. The remake of Return to Dreamland was released in a dead patch in spring, and it pretty much delivers all it promises. It's a polished, slightly stylized remake of the original Return to Dreamland on Wii, which is already a perfectly good Kirby game on its own right, but now made a lot more accessible. I enjoy Kirby 2D platformers, and since this one was created with multiplayer in mind, it was made even more fun thanks to it. However, after Forgotten Land from last year was so strong, this one just pales since it's a lot more simple and a remake of a game which is a decade older. Kirby is great, but I don't think games like this are ever going to be life-changing. But it's good, sweet fun, which is easy to approach and even more enjoyable with friends. But don't go in expecting to be surprised by anything. Unless you've never experienced a Kirby story before, then you'll at least get a little shock around the end.
Me? Gungaga!
Like Kirby Return to Dreamland, I'm happy this remake got made to make it more accessible to a new generation, and it's faithful to the original, but almost to a fault. There are some minor changes made, but the gameplay seems to be quite similar to the original, and that's a good thing since it was a lot of fun, and Zack is an incredibly fun protagonist to follow. Even if some of the intricacies of the story got a little lost on me, the story did a good job of introducing me to Zack, and I think that's what its main role was. It of course looks a lot better than the PSP original, and the new cutscenes look great, but there were some sections where it's clear that the new look was a priority over the actual animations. So while at some points the game looked amazing, some animations jarringly reminded me that the game is a lot older than it looks. To iron these issues out, the game would have needed some more time in the oven, but I understand why Square wanted this out in between the first two parts of the Final Fantasy VII Remake to properly contextualize Zack, so for that I can't really fault it. However, it was a little rough at some points because of it. In spite of this, the chapter structure of the game helped the pacing massively, and gave me clear points to take breaks and walk away, which I always appreciate. It also had plenty of side content to indulge in if I wanted to slow down my pace or just make Zack a bit stronger. I'm happy I went on my way to play it since it just made me even more hyped for Rebirth in February, but it's a shame it might have been a little rushed. Even though the Professor Layton games have always been cheap and accessible, I've avoided them. It's probably because I've always been pretty bad at brain teasers since my brain just doesn't seem to work that way, and I didn't want to have to look up solutions. But this year I saw the first entry, The Curious Village, being sold for a steal, so I finally took the plunge and tried it. And it pleasantly surprised me. The puzzles were mostly fun and just required focusing and some proper concentration, and they wouldn't take too long. With some I used hint coins, and I very rarely had to seek help outside of the game, but playing through these puzzles was a fun method of progression. The setting of the village also looked amazing on the DS and held up incredibly well, made even better was the sporadic animated scenes bringing the charming and intriguing story to life. I honestly regret avoiding this series for so long, and luckily almost every other entry is just as cheap, so I'm looking forward to working my way through the sequels and learning more about these characters. It's hard to describe Pikuniku. It's technically a platformer, but paced like an exploration adventure style game. Whatever it is, I had a great time for the couple of hours it took me to reach its conclusion. Pikuniku was made so much better by the writing being fully self-aware, making the journey all the more entertaining and building on the charming and goofy energy it established. There were some minor puzzle solving sections, but it was really just one of those games where you mess about and you'll eventually work out what you're doing, and will likely achieve your goals accidentally by just having fun. This style of game usually gets old quick, so the fact that the developers were aware of this and kept the pacing tight and story short was appreciated. Saying that, I would happily play a sequel made by the same team, even in the same style, since I played this all the way at the start of the year, and games with this unique energy don't come along too often. Compared to something like The Pathless, which seemed a bit confused with whether it wanted to be minimalist or indulge in exposition, Sayonara Wild Hearts, published by Annapurna Interactive as well, masters the more minimalist storytelling throughout its short runtime. The storytelling doesn't focus on details but more on feelings, and this fits a flashy rhythm game with an intense soundtrack like this perfectly. I sometimes struggle to play a game in one sitting, even if it's short, but with how well Sayonara Wild Hearts was paced and how simple it was to just go on to the next level, I did it easily. For a game so short, challenge can sometimes be a struggle since developers might not want to force you to get good for a game which you'll be done within an afternoon, but the strict grading system in Sayonara Wild Hearts meant you could always progress, but also incentivized coming back to do better. With a game so short, the conversation of how much a game should cost for how long it takes often comes up. This is actually quite prevalent this year, with Marvel's Spider-Man 2 being a little controversial for taking less than 30 hours to 100% and being full price. And while Sayonara Wild Hearts is a lower example, the 2-hour adventure costing around £15 full price is comparable. It's a tricky discussion since it depends on how you gauge worth, and also if you think you're going to replay a game, or on the other hand resell it. That's why it took me so long to take the plunge with Sayonara Wild Hearts, since even though I knew it was the kind of thing I would enjoy, I couldn't be sure if it would be worth it. But when I found a physical copy, which I didn't even know existed, for half the digital price, it was an easy buy. So, if you're unsure if this is the kind of thing you'll enjoy, I was right about my suspicions and my guess that I would enjoy this based on trailers and footage. But if you're still unsure, then get it in a format that will be easy to resell just in case. When I was talking about Game & Wario, I mentioned how the Wii U is the ideal party game machine, and Nintendo Land is an extension of that. I was really getting into gaming around the time the Wii U launched, and I remember seeing a lot of footage of Nintendo Land since it was a launch title, but it took me over a decade to actually play it myself with some friends, and I'm happy to say it doesn't disappoint and also holds up well too. Similarly to Game & Wario, it's a minigame collection, but this one uses the genius idea of basing each of the 12 off an iconic or not so iconic Nintendo IP. Unfortunately, only half are multiplayer, still a better ratio than Game & Wario, but all of them are a lot of fun and perfect for pick up and play multiplayer with friends no matter the gaming expertise, which is exactly what I was looking for. It's full of charm, like the game recording your face on the gamepad, catching unintentionally funny moments, and attention to detail with little Easter eggs and references hidden throughout the hub and each of the minigames. It's a shame Nintendo has stepped away from making games like this and using Miis as avatars, since it worked so well as a system. Sure, you can still make Miis on the Switch if you want, but their uses are limited. I honestly think Nintendo started to step away from them after the Wii U failed as some kind of punishment. But that's a shame since the alternatives like the unnerving avatars from the new sports game, or whatever 1-2 Switch and its sequel are going for, just don't hit the same. This is also a great way for Nintendo to reference their legacy and give tidbits to fans of more obscure series, and I wish they did something similar for the launch of the Switch, since anything would have been better than 1-2 Switch. It does feel a bit like low-hanging fruit going after 1-2 Switch almost 7 years after its launch, since it's been a punching bag essentially since it came out, but when Nintendo Land was such a strong launch title for the previous console, I think it's good to try and remind Nintendo to go for something more like this than that. I don't know why I went into Guardians of the Galaxy with such low expectations. I think that it might be something to do with my perceptions slightly being clouded by the wave of hate it got for dominating Square's E3 presentation with a bloated demo a couple of years ago, but upon actually playing it, I was happily surprised with how much fun I had. Guardians of the Galaxy is just another piece of my linear games are actually really good opinion I've been building up throughout the year, and it also reminded me why I like these characters. Like a lot of people, I was introduced to these characters with the MCU movies, and while I like those a lot, my opinion of them has been dragged down by my growing disinterest in the MCU as a whole. So, having this game recreate that sense of fun these characters incensed in their earlier appearances was weirdly nostalgic. With its linear levels, each setting looked amazing, and feels like a roller coaster with how you're on track, but everything is tailored for you to have as much fun as possible. It does feel a little unfair defining this game by its linear nature, since one of the top selling points was being able to make choices, and while these were fun, they felt a little bit more like minor role-playing than an actual mechanic. The story was also well told, and while I went in worried that the characters looking and sounding slightly different would feel uncanny, but the characterization was so good I didn't really notice. In fact, this douchier version of Star-Lord felt a little more fitting compared to whatever not Italian Mario was going for in the movies. If you like engaging and story-focused action games with RPG-style linear progression, or if you just miss the dynamic of the OG Guardians of the Galaxy, then I would recommend trying this, especially since I think very few people remember or even talk about this game, and it's quickly going from being just underrated to almost forgotten. My original untainted opinion of the first Atelier Ryza game is now a little harder to remember since, if you watch the first part, you'll know it's tainted by how much less I enjoyed the sequel. So I now have a permanent set of rose-tinted glasses glued on when talking about it, which I'll try to pry off by not just talking about how much I preferred it to the follow-up. However, the strength of Atelier Ryza, Everdarkness and the Secret Hideout is in its metered ambition and well-paced introduction to the alchemy system. The story is slow-paced and the lack of intense stakes for most of its runtime helps to relax the player and make approaching the game easy. And while the alchemy system seems complex at first, because it is, the game gives you achievable tasks that slope harder throughout the game while also introducing new systems that give you more options, and eventually make you feel more empowered. I mentioned it in the first part as well, but I really enjoy this core set of 4 characters we meet in the first game, and while I do wish we got to see a few more interactions between the characters aside from Ryza herself, focusing more on Ryza made her a more likeable protagonist, and that's why her lack of focus in the sequel bothered me. Do you see what I mean? I can't help but compliment this game and miss it because the follow-up is just categorically worse, from my perspective at least. Maybe once I eventually force myself to finish the second game and then move on to the hopefully better final part of the trilogy, I'll go back and make a self-contained retrospective, but for now I can't help but be stuck inadvertently insulting the sequel and perhaps overpraising the original. From my nostalgic relationship with Atelier Ryza 1 to my confused relationship with Persona 5, we have my complex but positive opinion on its spin-off slash sequel slash epilogue Persona 5 Strikers. I loved playing through Persona 5 Royal a couple of years ago, but after playing it I became a little jaded seeing it overrated since while it's a good time, I think its fans treat it as a far more mature story than it actually is, and my own likely nostalgia fueled bias towards Persona 4, but that's another topic. Aside from that, I still enjoy the Phantom Thieves, so I knew I would eventually return and play the conclusion to their story. I enjoy Muso style spin-offs, but I was surprised with just how well this melded the Persona gameplay with it, and it made for a much less mindless experience than I expected. The story was also more guided and varied, but also way less formulaic than expected, and since the campaign was so much shorter than the baseline Persona 5, only taking around 30 hours to complete compared to 100, I found myself having no trouble getting immersed in a fast-paced play session. I don't love the Persona trend of having to introduce new one-off characters for every spin-off, since I think it's a cop-out from having to further develop the pre-established characters we already have. But again, I was shocked that both of the new characters were entertaining, and while I would have liked more time with the main cast, the fact that they each got their own moment was at least something. The road trip format was a great method for keeping the pace up and gave the game a distinct identity from the original, which was exactly what I was hoping for. I think I put off Strikers for too long because I was worried it would just be a Persona 5 Muso game, but because the developers put clear effort into giving it a distinct identity, I managed to have more fun than I expected. I've left Persona 5 Strikers with an improved image of the original game, this game, and the series as a whole, and while I'm not going to jump right into other spin-offs like Tactica, I'm going to be more excited for when I eventually will. Similarly to Atelier Ryza 1 and 2, this is part of a franchise I'm going to talk about out of order, only now it's a little more complex since this year I played, in order, Resident Evil 4 Remake, then 2 Remake, then 3 Remake, but also took a massive break in the middle, only finishing it quite recently. So while I played the games out of order, I'm further mixing it up thanks to ranking them out of order as well. Even if 3 Remake is my least favourite of the 3 entries I played this year, I still had a great time working through it. It's just in a slightly weird position, being between 2 games which I preferred. And that feeling is accentuated since it also feels like a hybrid of 2 and 4 in how it's paced and structured. The overall narrative is about the same length of one playthrough of 2, but the areas you explore, especially later in the game, are more linear like they are in 4. This meant that it never ended up being able to properly play to either of the strengths those titles had, since it feels like it's straddling a different approach in the middle. What I did love was how structured the story was and how you switch between Jill and Carlos at set intervals. The opening streets and the hospital were some of my favourite areas to explore, maybe because they reminded me of some of 2's best areas, but one negative compared to the other two is that the story felt a little weaker because of a lack of more threatening antagonist. Nemesis starts off threatening, but the more he transforms, even if he was getting stronger, he felt less imposing. And Nikolai was clearly a bad guy, but it felt like he was a little underdeveloped, so I never really cared about what he was doing, and since there isn't a real boss battle with him, I didn't ever perceive him as a threat. In spite of all these negative comparisons I'm making to 2 and 4, 3 Remake is still a great time, and while it would definitely be an awkward starting point, if you like 2 or 4, you'll still find something to enjoy here. I spent most of July playing a long game which I'll get to later, but afterwards I wanted something fun, lighthearted and refreshing, and Lil Gator Game was exactly what I needed. It only takes about 3 hours to complete, but all 3 of those hours were spent finding secrets throughout the map full of details and fun little challenges and activities. The gameplay can best be described as Breath of the Wild light, so you can climb and platform wherever if you have enough stamina, and gliding is an option as well. I've never played a game which has so quickly had everyone else in the room wanting to have a go, so for some sections I had to relent control of Cheese Scone, the name of my crocodile, to my flatmates and let them mess around in the playground this game sets out for you. It could have easily felt too simple, but the challenges you're given require some basic puzzle solving, which is never too hard, but means you can't completely turn your brain off. But what I appreciate is that the game doesn't force you to achieve too many of the goals to progress the story, making this feel more like leisure time and less of a chore. It's also worth mentioning that the story, while simple, is incredibly sweet, and the kind of unpatronizing narrative I wish more games aimed at kids would go for. If you want something like Breath of the Wild, but way less of a commitment and a bit more goofy, then try it out. Even though I find the art style a little jarring, the Danganronpa series has always intrigued me, but I haven't played any of them since I got the story spoiled, but I might still try them at some point, since I'm sure there's a lot more to them than just the main story points. But last year I played World's End Club, a game made by the same team, and while the gameplay was below average, the storytelling was great. So when I saw the same team had a new game coming out this year with a different style of gameplay, I was hesitantly excited for it. While it was a little too slow paced for my taste, Master Detective Archive's Raincode was a lot of fun and bursting with personality. The overarching narrative and mystery was a lot of fun to uncover, and similarly to World's End Club, it's not something you'll catch on to and you'll be kept guessing the whole time. Even though the gameplay wasn't perfect, it was leagues better than World's End Club. The map, while limited, was detailed and looked great on Switch, and it was a great setting for some minor exploration for the investigations. What I didn't love were the dungeons you're transported to that allow you to uncover the truth behind a mystery. The pacing of an investigation is slowed down massively, they're bulky and take too long to get through, have repetitive designs, and they spend so long spelling out the answer that you're just begging to get to the end most of the time, especially later in the game when they get longer. In spite of that, the storytelling was strong enough to help me get through, and even though the look of the dungeons was repetitive, the overall style helped me stay engaged. The characters were alright, with some being more enjoyable than others, and unfortunately Shinigami, the companion, just got to be too much. Her character was just a bit too tropey, and even though her behaviour was supposed to be annoying and the main character calls her annoying, that doesn't mean she's any less annoying. Even though these grievances could have killed my interest in a worse game, because of how strong the other aspects of Raincode were, I was able to push through, and if it looks like the kind of thing you'll be interested in, then you'll probably enjoy it in spite of the flaws like I did. Like Raincode, Great Ace Attorney Adventures is a slower paced mystery investigation game, but it stands just above for its slightly improved pacing and more cohesive gameplay. Raincode tries a lot of things, taking advantage of being something completely new, even if that means a lot of it fails. While Great Ace Attorney Adventures is a prequel, it's a part of an established series, so its gameplay is a lot more confident in what it is, and that makes for a more enjoyable experience to get through. I also really enjoyed the cast of characters I was introduced to, with Runosuke and Herlock making perfect counters throughout the 5 chapters we get to know them. But even side characters are characterized and animated so well that the short insight we get for them is a lot of fun to see. This is my first Ace Attorney game and I've been meaning to play it for a while, especially since a couple of friends have really got into the original trilogy, but of course I had to be awkward and go and start with the prequel. And this game looks amazing. The backgrounds are clearly crafted with love, and while the character models are 3D, they're just as expressive and full of life as traditional 2D animations like the sprites in the original series. My main issue, like with Raincode, is the pacing. A common critique I've noticed with the whole Ace Attorney series is that the trials sometimes just last a little too long, and you'll have uncovered the mystery long before you're allowed to finish. There are no shortcuts after all. While it is an entertaining one with lots of set dressing, this is still a visual novel. But it wasn't as bad as it got with Raincode, even though I still found myself occasionally mashing through dialogue at some points. The two great Ace Attorney games often get bundled together, and in most territories are often impossible to buy without the other, so most people, me included, don't notice that the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is actually 2 games split into 2 sets of 5 chapters. But after finishing the first 5, the overarching narrative didn't come to an end, but a natural stopping point, so I took that as a chance to leave a cap on it and come back to the second game in the short series when I'm refreshed and ready for it. I don't know why, but I never expected to like Tokyo Mirage Sessions that much, so I was surprised when I became so obsessed with it while I was playing through. I enjoy the Fire Emblem games I've played, but never got into the main series enough to seek out spin-off content, and while I plan to play some entries in the Shin Megami Tensei series, I haven't made that dive yet, so a crossover between the two franchises shouldn't really interest me that much. But seemingly this crossover wasn't really designed for fans of those series much either, since the game seems to take just as much, if not more, inspiration from J-pop idol culture than it does the gaming series it lends from, and this unique fusion is what led me to eventually try it out. Tokyo Mirage Sessions is far from perfect. Its characters have potential, but unfortunately don't get enough development, especially the more interesting ones. The overarching narrative plays by the numbers to a fault, and the presentation, while charming, is nothing to write home about. But in spite of all of this, the core gameplay was enjoyable and fresh enough for me to want to keep going, and the temptation to continue for another catchy J-pop song helped as well. It honestly feels like a bit of a miracle this game even exists. I don't know how everything got approved and they thought there was an audience for it, but it's me. I'm the audience. In a parallel universe, this game could have failed at everything it tried in the same way I see Rune Factory 5, but it succeeds so well at core aspects, and its side aspects are charming enough to make a thoroughly enjoyable JRPG. Whether you're a fan of Shin Megami Tensei or Fire Emblem or not, since the inspirations are barely there anyway, or if you're just a fan of JRPGs or just like the look of it, Tokyo Mirage Sessions is a good time, and if you want to hear me rant about it even more, then check out my ranking of every song in the game. If you told me that between the sequel to Breath of the Wild, part of my all-time favourite gaming series, and an extreme sports open world game, I would prefer the latter, I would have pissed myself laughing at you. But here we are. That's not to say I went into Riders Republic expecting the worst. It always looked cool, and the idea of a massive stunning map drawing the best parts from multiple national parks, and while extreme sports games have never done much for me, this one had something I was interested in. So I picked it up cheap and was astounded with just how much fun I had. Working my way to races from set fast travel points made the setting feel real, and the races themselves had an amazing sense of speed, especially on bike races, but the snow sports and wingsuit events were also great to play, and had the right level of challenge as well. And not to repeat myself, but I cannot praise how great this game looks, taking full advantage of what the PS5 can do. It is worth mentioning that after trying them a couple of times, I completely abandoned going for the bike and snow trick events, since racing was just a lot more fun than trying to rack up combos under a time limit. But if you like both, then you'll get even more out of it. There are some things that could be improved with a sequel or an update, my main issue being that it's hard to find certain races on the map again after completion, since even though they're marked out and titled, it's difficult to actually know which race was which marker on the map, so a favourite or star system would have been perfect. But still, this game was a lot of fun to play through, and I can easily see myself going back to go through some races when I want something refreshing and different from the kind of thing I would usually play. Making its way into the top 25 is a remake for Resident Evil 2, which was very similar to the remake for 3, which makes sense since they were released a year apart, but I just love how well this one was structured. Me and my flatmates started off with Leon's campaign, taking turns with each death, and while it felt very different coming off of 4, I at least found the change of pace to be refreshing. The horror and survival elements also felt like they'd been turned way up, with resource management feeling tougher and more chances of enemies actually jump scaring you. Since this was a much less linear experience, it was harder to predict where anything would come from. All of the environments were detailed and looked amazing, making them a terrifying joy to explore, with the police station of course being a highlight. Both Leon and Claire were likeable protagonists, and their stories felt engaging with a much clearer antagonistic force than there was in 3. However, 2 would be a lot higher if it weren't for how the game encourages you to play. After you beat your first run, you're encouraged to play again using the other character to get the true ending. So that's what we did, since we researched and saw that some elements were shortened to make it a quicker run through. And while yes, it was quicker, it wasn't quick enough, since so many areas were revisited and required incredibly similar solutions. The start of the game isn't too rough, since Claire takes quite a different approach to the police station to Leon, and after that the orphanage scenes are entirely unique to Claire. But then after this, the entire second half of the game feels almost completely copy and pasted, with only certain small sections changed to alternate cutscenes. The fact that you're repeating entire puzzle sequences completely killed the pacing and really soured my memory of the game. If you're going to lock the real ending behind a second playthrough, then leave those puzzles completed, since it completely kills the immersion that Leon and Claire are working simultaneously if the exact same puzzle needs to be completed in the same world. The first playthrough was still a great time, I just wish the complete experience was laid out differently. First of all, boo Nintendo for being incapable of properly supporting your live service games on your 3rd attempt. I love the core gameplay of Splatoon games, and I've tried each one since the first in 2015, and while they're always fun for a while, unless you want to get competitive, there isn't too much reason to keep playing after a certain point with how infrequent and unsubstantial updates are. Aside from that, Splatoon games are getting incrementally stronger overall, and the main strength for me with Splatoon 3 was how much more effort had been put into the base game single player this time, with a more involved story and even better level and hub world design. After seeing the potential with Octo expansion for 2, I'm happy to see the narrative momentum has been maintained. For the multiplayer, it'll always be fun for a while, and this time I mostly stuck with Turf War since it's what I enjoy the most with Splatoon. And while the map rotation system still feels imperfect, the extra quality of life features included make the overall feel of the game a lot smoother. It does feel like the hub world is a little barren with not much to do, especially if you struggle to get into the card game, and this feeling is only accentuated with how bare bones the first wave of DLC looks, but I do have higher hopes for the second. It feels weird critiquing a game so heavily even though I enjoyed it so much, but because the core gameplay of Splatoon is fun, and since the sequels always feel quite minor, I'm just a bit harsh on Nintendo for not doing more with it. I really hope Wave 2 DLC fixes some of these gripes, but it's a game I'll return to regularly since the gameplay loop of Splatoon is just that strong. While I have issues with how unambitious Nintendo is with Splatoon, those issues are only heightened when looking at the modern state of Pokemon. I used to be an annual day one purchase type of fan, but ever since the Diamond and Pearl remakes coming off the tail of Sword and Shield, I've essentially been boycotting. That's not to say I don't still love elements of the franchise. For example, I just replayed Explorers of Sky earlier this year and it held up amazingly, but when it comes to the new games, I just haven't had any desire to go back. But I was still craving something similar to a mainline game, so when I saw a video mention fan game Pokemon Castaway and I saw it have one of my favourite evolution lines as a starter, I couldn't really resist. It leaves you literally stranded after a plane crash and you're stuck salvaging whatever you can find and then exploring the island and learning more about the setting. I was surprised with just how strong the narrative of the game was, with some decent storytelling done more subtly through the environment instead of dumps of exposition, and while it was nothing breathtaking, it was still interesting enough to keep me guessing. And since it had a unique structure and was a lot shorter than a traditional Pokemon game, I actually didn't know what was coming next. I'm honestly ashamed that this is the first Pokemon fan game I've played, and it leaves me hopeful to try more instead of sticking with the mainline, which usually just leaves me disappointed and frustrated. Like, this franchise has so much potential for more interesting games and stories, and Pokemon Company have the resources to fund them, but they seem content putting as little time and effort into their games as possible. I could honestly rant forever, and maybe I will another time, but going back to the positive, check out Pokemon Castaway if you want something refreshing. I don't know why I went into Cult of the Lamb with such low expectations, since I'd heard pretty much nothing bad about it before. Maybe it's because I don't love town building style games, maybe it's because the presentation didn't really connect with me from the trailers I'd seen, or maybe I just assumed it would be much longer, but when I actually tried it, everything clicked. Roguelites can often feel endless and lack any sense of progression, like the second half of Endless Dungeon for example, but that was never a problem here. The runs were quick, all being about 10 minutes long, and the gameplay never felt slow or tedious. And even though I was worried about the town builder gameplay being overbearing, it instead managed to balance feeling impactful while also not needing too much attention between runs. So, while I expected to dread having to check on my cult between runs, it was something I always looked forward to since the impact it had on my character and story growth was always palpable, while also giving me a sense of customizability. And while I didn't love how the game looked in trailers, the presentation combined with the amazing soundtrack worked together to create something really unique that I love to look and listen to. The level of challenge was also perfect for me, not feeling like a pushover by any means, but also never being able to let your guard down either. And having different maps instead of a big sprawling one meant I never got tired of how it looked or the enemies. There are some more nitpicky issues I had, but nothing major, and I'm so happy that the developers are still supporting this game since I will happily return to it. Every year, for the last few years, it's been an unintentional tradition of mine to play at least one Metroidvania and get obsessed and love it, and this year is no different, with Blasphemous being the only one I played. Because I played it so early in the year and because I devoured it so aggressively, specific details are a little blurry, but I have the strong memory of just having a great time with it. It was also more on the challenging side, especially when compared to Ori and the Blind Forest and Metroid Dread, which I played the year before, and that isn't a bad thing. However, it did slightly discourage me from aiming for the true ending in my playthrough. I wanted my experience the first time to be completely blind, so I didn't look for any guidance and just got to credits in a way that felt natural. So even though I didn't reach the canonical ending, I did still have a great time working through this amazing stylized setting, not stressing about meeting certain criteria and just having a good time. The combat was snappy and satisfying, and even though I wasn't really following the story, I still found the setting engaging and just wanted to discover more of it motivated me to continue. I've seen that the sequel came out in 2023 as well, so I hope it's as good as the first one, since I'm more than happy to return to this slightly grotesque but beautiful world whenever.
1, 2, 3!
Finishing this part feels a lot nicer than the last one, since this video was just a lot more positive to work through, since even though it feels like some of these games are quite low, I still like and even loved a lot of them. Getting towards the end, I was really tempted to move some games even higher into the top 20, but I had to resist since the last section is so strong. I can't wait to go over my top 20 since I played some amazing games this year, and those are of course the best of the best in my opinion. But that'll be posted this time next week, so if you want something similar, you can either go back and watch part 1 if you missed it, or my much shorter ranking from last year which all fits into one video. But if you just want to see the next part, then subscribing is the best way to get notified when it's posted. So see you then.